Good evening, everyone. I am Modeng. Today, we're going to do a sharing. I've actually been preparing this PPT for quite a while. It's probably the PPT I've spent the longest time preparing. So the content I'm sharing today is definitely practical, especially for students without an art background. I suggest you listen carefully. So our title is From Mediocrity to Mastery, Elevating the Quality of Your 3D Game Environment Art, an analysis based on the foundational principles of art. Okay, so let's start with the most basic art knowledge points. When we are still art students, we use slang to help to break down terminology. For example, the three relationships and three planes we often talk about are the light area, the gray area, and the dark area, also known as black, white, and gray. So black is usually said to be the darkest part of the picture. And white is the brightest part, also the part that receives light. Black is the shadow part, shadow or backlight. And gray is the part between the light and the backlight. So this concept is a very, very important concept that directly runs through our entire art career. The concept of black, white, and gray exists throughout. Then there are the five tones. The five tones are actually a black, white, and gray. So more subdivided concept. So it's also the light area, gray area, and dark area. Then it adds a highlight. Then it adds a reflection. Then there's also the line of demarcation between light and dark. The line of demarcation between light and dark is between light and dark. The deepest, a line. The line with the deepest color, the darkest line. And then there are shadows. Let's also talk about the slang used by art students. These are some of the adjectives we use most often. For example, dirty, this picture is dirty. That is to say, the black, white, and gray in this picture are not clear. The relationship between black, white, and gray is not clear. The color is relatively turbulent, lacking a clear color tendency. And then comes flat. Flat means the picture lacks three-dimensionality and spatial layers, insufficient contrast between light and dark. The whole thing seems pretty monotonous, commonly seen when the three planes are not handled well. That is the transition of the three planes of black, white, and gray. We can take a look at the picture below. Normally this has a three-dimensional relationship, then flat. That means the light and shadow are relatively flat. That is lacking contrast, lacking three-dimensionality. Then chaotic. This is self-explanatory. That is the whole picture. It's jumping everywhere. Then it's very chaotic, and your eyes don't know where to look. Powdery, this is generally more often used to describe color painting. That is to say, the whole picture looks relatively pale, lacking color saturation. Raw. This is also used more to describe color painting. That is to say, the color is too bright and dazzling, lacking transition and harmony. It seems unnatural. Floating means it lacks shadows, or it feels like the base is unstable, so it feels like it's floating. Muted means the entire dark area of the picture lacks reflection, which leads to the space being blocked. It also means that it is not breathable, and the entire picture is relatively full and not breathable. Gray means its contrast is relatively weak. Insufficient contrast between light and dark. That is, the entire gray tone accounts for a large proportion, and the contrast between light and dark is insufficient. Then fragmented is actually similar to chaotic. That is, the details are just too trivial and incomplete. Next one is floral. Floral means colors or details are chaotic with certain areas overly dominant, contributing to a sense of disharmony alongside jumping. That is, it reflects the disharmony of the picture. Full means that the entire picture elements are filled too densely, lacking contrast between virtual and real and breathing space. Commonly seen in cases where the composition is greedy for everything. The details are piled up too much or the color is too thick. Solid is actually similar to full, so it also feels like it's not breathable. Then empty. That is, there are too few elements, and it is relatively empty, lacking its element. We can take a look at this empty. Then let's look at the picture above. This is the picture submitted by the student in the last live broadcast. Actually, I think this picture is more representative. That is, first of all, it is relatively full and solid, is because there is no sense of space. So it feels more solid. Muted is also because the sky is not exposed above. So I feel that this person cannot breathe. I don't know if you all have this feeling. When looking at a picture, you will look at its picture, whether it is relatively fresh or relatively dull or relatively depressing or relatively cheerful. Yes, I think this picture can convey an emotion to us. Then let's look at the second one. What is contrast? In game scenes, contrast is an important visual and narrative technique. It is used to enhance the expressiveness of the scene, guide the player's attention, create an atmosphere, and enhance the overall visual effect. Contrast can be achieved in many forms and ways. Contrast of light and dark, color contrast, space, density, virtual and real, etc. Let's give an example. For example, this kind of picture. So what part do you think has the strongest contrast? This is our sharing session, so everyone can interact more. What part do you think has the strongest contrast? Okay, so the strongest contrast is actually between the shadow and the character. Of course, there's also the door and the shadow. The door and shadow also have very strong contrast. This is strong contrast. Then if we make the character white, what's the first thing you see? Well, I think the first thing you'll definitely see is the shadow, because the shadow has more details than the silhouette. Of course, the door's projection will also be seen first. That shadow is a strong contrast. If we remove the shadow and only leave the character, then the strongest contrast you see is still between the door and the character. Okay, then we'll add a few more characters. Let's take a look. So we added a few more characters, although this character is the same as him, but because he's in the shadow, his contrast will be weaker. So the first thing we see is still him. But yeah, our eyes will notice the character with the weak contrast next to him. Then I'll turn this character into self-illuminating. So where do we see first UV break? Which of these two stands out more? They're actually about the same, but this one stands out a bit more. Why? Because the light and dark contrast is stronger. This is a stronger light and dark contrast. Also, his silhouette is clearer. So yeah, he stands out more than if we make all the characters self-illuminating. Then the whole picture, now feel it's very messy. Very messy. Why? Because your contrast is very chaotic. You have no focus anymore. You don't know where the focus is. Maybe we want to show that the main character is the focus, but because the surrounding contrast is strengthened, your eyes don't know where to look. Next, I'll turn this character red. Then everyone has a focus again. Right. This focus has become the red character again because he's different from the other white ones. Because the same elements weaken the contrast. Although each element is strong because it's used over a large area, his elements are the same. So it weakens the contrast. If one of the elements is different, it will stand out. It will enhance the contrast. Then I'll put all this into a room. Then this is also very eye-catching. Then I light up the room. Then this character is still self-illuminating. Similarly, this is also very eye-catching. But at the same time, the contrast of the other characters will also be slightly enhanced. Because his detail and light exposure are stronger. So if I want to further enhance the contrast of this character, what should I do? Then I turn the back into black. If the back turns black, then the contrast is the strongest. This is the light and dark contrast, which is the strongest in black and white contrast. Besides color, the black and white contrast is the strongest. So we kind of played the role of enhancing his contrast. Next, let's talk about what levels are. Because in the process of lecturing and when tutoring students' homework, I often say contrast, black, white, gray, relationship levels. Then many newcomers, especially those without art foundation. I don't know what this is about. So in this lesson, we will popularize it for everyone. That is the basic art theory. What are levels? UV levels are according to this. That is, scene levels are through the picture elements according to the spatial relationship. Foreground, middle ground, background, and visual priority, primary and secondary, virtual and real contrast are layered for design. Enhance the three-dimensionality of the picture, guide the viewer's line of sight, and convey narrative information. Classification and implementation methods of scene levels. Spatial levels are the foreground, middle ground, and background. Generally, the foreground has some high detail, high contrast elements such as vegetation or projections. In many cases, we deliberately treat the foreground as a dark or projected part. This is for framing composition. Framing composition is also a very common composition we use. Framing the boundaries of the picture and highlighting its middle ground. Because in the scene, the middle ground is generally its visual center. Because the distance of the middle ground is easier to express its narrative sense of space and its focus. So we generally use the middle ground as the visual center. Then the background is a low saturation blurred background, or some are simply silhouette, because it is due to the reason of aerial perspective. Let's look at this picture. This is a picture made by a big shot from a station. Then let's take a look at this. The levels are very clear. If we turn it into a black and white picture, then black is the foreground, gray is the middle ground, and light color is the background. I've done this side scroller for a few years before, done side scrolling games for a few years. Then side scrolling games emphasize levels very much, very emphasize its level. We can take a look. Why do we distinguish these levels like this? Because after you distinguish it like this, you will find that it has a sense of space, right? Like it has a sense of space. It has a theme. It has that is like, this is breathable. This picture is breathable. Then if you have drawn original painting students often use this method to draw original painting. There are two ways for original painting students to start drawing. One is a direct line draft sketch, right? There's another way, which is to directly use this block that is color blocks to start drawing. Then, like many of our original painting students before, he directly used this color block to first express its composition and this level relationship, including light and shadow to express it after it is expressed. You refine it, foreground, middle ground, background. Okay, so after we turn it gray, we can see the same level of view, for example, our foreground, the same level of view. Its contrast is relatively uniform. We found that, for example, the foreground is dark. Then its contrast is almost the same. It won't have something that stands out. Then the middle ground is the same. So let's look at this plant. Its gray level is basically the same. So the distant view is even closer because the distant view is affected by atmospheric scattering and distance. So its contrast will be weaker. So this also aligns with our initial intention of drawing silhouette images, because the final picture you present must also conform to the hierarchical pattern of the silhouette, which is the relationship of black, white, and gray. Okay, let's look at this aisle picture. Similarly, I divided it into black, white, and gray, namely foreground, midground, and background. So on this basis, because it doesn't look very detailed, right, then we can subdivide it further. Add the middle layers, then you will feel more abundant. It's not just 3 layers, foreground, midground, and background, right? It also added some transitional layers in the middle. Then we transform it into a grayscale image. Let's take a look at the comparison. Actually, if you refine this image, you can finally achieve the effect of this grayscale image. So this is the most basic rule of scene art. Everyone must pay attention. This is very important. The most basic rule. Okay, let's look at this Tsushima Island picture. Similarly, we can summarize it as foreground, midground, and background. Okay, foreground, midground, and background. So this grayscale image. The colors of the foreground and midground are almost the same in brightness. Almost the same. Actually, it can be darker. If we divide according to our level, it can be darker. So this is also okay because the midground is so bright. So these two spaces are divided. What if there is no middle level? If there is no middle level, then this will be connected, right? The midground and foreground will be connected together. And the result of being connected is that the levels will be indistinguishable. Okay, let's look at the game This game is also a game that we referred to a lot when we made side-scrolling games before. Is it like a benchmark for this side-scrolling? Like, it was quite shocking when it came out in terms of art. Then we can also divide it into foreground, midground, and background. Then we can see that the foreground is basically, first of all, it has a depth of field. And then the entire color is relatively uniform and dark. Then the midground, as we just said. The midground is a narrative theme. In here, the most important expressiveness is placed in the midground. So the background also adds depth of field. Similarly, let's take a look at the light and dark contrast of the background, which is also relatively weak. So in this way, it will highlight the midground, highlight our walking layer. That is the walking layer of our character. So the midground. Similarly, look at this picture. This picture is more classic. So this is in the TG of Orai, the first screen. So it doesn't have a foreground, but it's midground. You can see that the contrast between light and dark in midground is very strong, and the dark part is almost black. Right? The contrast between light and dark is very strong, and its level of detail is also very strong. So in this way, it will create a level of contrast between light and dark, and its color richness will also be distinguished from the midground and background. So we see that the midground will be weaker, and then the background, it's almost no contrast. It's just a single color. It's a single color silhouette. Let's look at the grayscale image. So the grayscale image is also the most prominent, and the most prominent part of the entire screen is its walking layer. Okay, let's look at Joseph's watercolor painting. Joseph's watercolor painting, we can see, so what is the most prominent part of this entire picture? What do you think is the most prominent element in this painting?
Yes.
The car, yes. Why? Because the car has the strongest contrast between light and dark, and its colors are the most abundant. Right? The strongest contrast between light and dark, the most abundant colors. So what about the midground? What about the midground and background? Relatively speaking, its level of detail and its contrast will be reduced. So the background is more of a silhouette. You may only know that it is a building, but you don't know what it looks like specifically. What are the details inside it? Yes, the road is also a contrast. But the most important thing is the road is because we have a walking route. And it will emphasize its walking route. Why emphasize the walking route? It will express its narrative sense. Because you don't have a road, the character doesn't know where to go. That is, it doesn't have a forward-like guidance. So this road is also more emphasized than the most emphasized is its subject. Okay, let's turn it into a grayscale image. So the car light just now cannot be seen in the grayscale image because it is consistent in gray in that color and brightness. And it is prominent color. Okay, let's look at the second picture. So what is the most prominent in the second picture? Let's take a look. Where do you see at first glance what everyone sees at first glance? The umbrella. What do you see at first glance is the umbrella and two people. Yes, very correct. Why do you see the umbrella and two people? Because of the human form. When we look at people, our vision is very sensitive to the silhouette of the human form, which is one of the factors. In addition, the contrast of this human form is also the strongest. When Joseph paints this picture, he often puts the protagonist, the part of the protagonist, he adds backlighting to it, this kind of highlight, strengthen the contrast, and increase the feeling of backlighting. So this and its level is also very rich. So, for example, this character and this character, right? So its entire color block, it is divided into several color blocks. So the contrast is also relatively strong. So we will see this umbrella. The umbrella is because of this. One is the large area, and another is that its color is more jumping, and the color saturation is higher. So we will pay attention to the umbrella and the character. So what will not be noticed, UV break? What will not be noticed is the circular building, right? And the road surface and these shadow parts. Why are the road surface and shadow parts noticed? Because its color is more uniform. Its contrast is weaker, except for this place. This place is the contrast generated by light and shadow. That is, the entire shadow part has a weaker contrast. So we don't pay much attention to this place.
And the sky.
Then let's take a look at this black and white picture. So the contrast of this black and white picture is very strong for the umbrella, including the character here. The contrast between light and dark is very strong, so we will notice it. We were inspired by Joseph's word. Strengthen the contrast in the main part and weaken the contrast in the secondary part. For example, the main one is our character. This umbrella, that is the tent. Right? The secondary part is the building in the background, in the ground, and the shadow part. The second is that the blank space makes the picture transparent. That is absolutely breathable. Looking at Joseph's words, he used a large area of blank space. Just showing the sky, he will feel very transparent, very breathable, this feeling. Then the color contrast plays a decorative role, and the color contrast plays a decorative role, accounting for a small proportion of the screen. If the main colors are bright and occupy a large area, then our vision will feel more tired. So the decorative effect is better. Then the fourth is to increase the rhythm of the picture by controlling different contrast. The sense of rhythm determines whether a painting is pleasing to the eye and guides the reading order. We will talk about this later, such as the sense of rhythm. This picture is very rich and very complex. So at first glance, we will see the character and the tent. Right. Then there are these tents below. You will notice what they are doing, what they are selling. Right. Then you will notice the vertical landscape, the sky, and the road. Then, in this way, we will have a reading order. Yes, people in backlight, we will have a reading order. You feel that this picture is very pleasing to the eye. Very pleasing to the eye. Why? It's because this is like when we read a composition. It will give us an order. Otherwise, if you suddenly give you a paragraph of text, you don't know where to start reading. That is no order, and you will feel confused. Okay, so next we are going to talk about the core elements and improvement strategies. So we have really popularized what is contrast and what is level. Yeah. Next, we will analyze the contrast and level more deeply. So the first element is the primary and secondary relationship, the visual hierarchy. A common problem is that the scene elements are averaged and there is a lack of visual focus. The solution is that we must adopt the 361 rule, which is 30 key area plus 60 transition plus 10 blank space. You can use this as a reference to tell you that it will have a proportion. In the main element and the non-main element, what is the proportion in the picture? There will be a proportion. Another is the design of guidelines, the visual path formed by the projection of architectural structure, light and shadow. Also, the main body enhances the contrast, and the secondary part reduces the contrast. This is to actively enhance and reduce the contrast. Also, cautious control, the method of verification. Everyone pays attention. So this point is very critical. If you look at your own work, I don't know if there is a problem with the primary and secondary relationship. That is lack of focus. Is it lack of focus? Then everyone can use this method, which is the 3-second rule. Screenshots from any perspective need to identify the visual focus in 3 seconds. That is, can your picture show the visual focus in 3 seconds? If you can't see it, it means that there is a problem with your primary and secondary relationship. Okay, let's take a look at a painting with a high rate on this site. Looking at this painting, where do you think the subject or focus is? Where do you think the subject and focus? Houses. Yes. House. Why is it the house UV break? We can analyze it like this. Because, first of all, our guideline will guide towards the house. In addition, this house has the richest details, the richest elements, and the richest structure element. In addition, its large unsaturated colors are also different from the surrounding environment. Because the surrounding environment is mostly green paper. Then suddenly there is a piece of orange tile, then it will be very prominent, very prominent. Just like the experiment we did just now, like that character, if the large area is the same character, then you won't notice the large area elements. We will only notice the small area of different elements. In addition, saturation will be relatively high, so we will notice it. Then what will we pay attention to next? It's the deer. Because the deer has a certain guiding, and the elements of the deer are also relatively rich. And the contrast will be slightly stronger. Secondly, you will notice the paperback, the stones, and the kid. In this way, our picture has a sense of rhythm. How is the sense of rhythm produced? It is because your focus, that is the main body, the center, and the subcenter and other visual centers. It will produce a certain rhythm and transmission, right? You will have a certain reading order. Okay, let's look at the picture below. Then this picture is the same. A large area of green paper, suddenly a white wall, an orange tiled house. And it is very, very prominent, right? We will notice it. Similarly, our guideline also guides to this house. Then this also has other highlights, for example. First, I will notice here. Second, I will notice the flower here because the element richness of this flower is also very rich, and the contrast is relatively strong. Then I will notice these places, right? These different shrubs and the road. Okay, and then let's take a look at the remake of The Last of Us. The remake of The Last of Us. What? Let's look at these two pictures. Where is the focus of the picture on the left? Where is the focus of the picture on the right? Can you see it? Think about it first. Yes, the river, because the river is very prominent on the right. Why is the river prominent? Because it's light and dark contrast. That is the contrast between black, white, and gray is the strongest. Then on the left, its contrast will be weaker, and the focus will not be prominent because you see when we look at the waterfall and the building and the landscape and these things, there is no difference. That is, its contrast and its highlights are similar. So there's no difference, right? The focus is not prominent. Then we look at the one on the right. Its focus is very prominent because this is the place with the strongest contrast between light and dark in the entire picture. The degree of detail is also the highest. That is, it contains the highest types and details of elements. The visual center is clear. Then, so weak in the secondary parts. See, the foreground is secondary part. This is definitely a secondary part because we have primary and secondary so that the picture will be prominent. If all of us are the main ones, then this picture is flat, not prominent, right? Or messy. So the foreground deliberately created the foreground to weaken its contrast. That is to homogenize its elements, element homogenization. In this way, if the elements are relatively consistent, you will not notice it. Right. Won't notice it. UV bright. You will notice the places where the elements are different. In the picture on the left, you see it is the same. It also did not do this secondary part and did not do the contrast reduction. The whole picture is similar. Okay, let's look at this picture. This picture is more obvious. Let's look at the picture on the left. In the picture on the left, in fact, if you look closely, you don't know where to look specifically.
I don't know.
Because if you want to see this train, you can't see it clearly.
Yeah.
If you want to see the road in the distance, you can't see it clearly, right? Or if you want to see the one above, for example, the sky is broken, is not very clear. It causes the whole picture to feel no focus. Then let's look at the right, UV break. This is that the direction of the light source is not prominent. The whole scene is relatively boring. The main center is not prominent. And there's also a lack of sub-centers. Let's look here, UV bra. At first glance, I still see this point with the strongest contrast. The light and the contrast between light and dark above are very strong.
The second thing you'll see is the train where the detail and contrast are also quite strong.
And third, we see the distant view because we know we can definitely get through to that distant view by going this way. Right. If we were playing this game, going this way would be the correct route because it's somewhat guiding. Okay, now let's look at this picture. This picture has the same problem. The visual hierarchy is quite simple, and it's too dark, lacking detail and highlights, and the texture representation is weak. Then we look at the one on the right. Looking at the viewing order, the first thing you'll see is definitely the area with the strongest contrast between light and dark, which is this area, right? The strongest contrast. And the second thing you'll notice is this area because the train is half submerged in the water, making it stand out. Also, its elements are relatively rich. A dilapidated roof, mechanical wreckage, waterlogged carriages. So you feel this unconventional layout creates a desire to explore. So the feeling this scene gives us is that it definitely has a story. Right? How did the water rise, or how was the wall broken? Right? How was this train abandoned? Right? Like, what is this pile of stuff? Well, have a desire to explore. But on the left, you can't see anything clearly, right? You can't explore even if you want to. You can't see anything clearly, and there's no focus. Okay, let me look at this picture. The problem with the lighting in this picture is that it's too flat, lacking volume and depth.
And on the right, the focus isn't prominent either.
And on the right, they deliberately process the light into a backlight. And that is to highlight the contrast between light and dark and to highlight the focus. So where is the focus? The focus is definitely the area with the strongest contrast, the most element rich and the strongest contrast. That's definitely this area, right? This area is the focus with clear layers. That is foreground, midground, and background. Okay, this picture, let's take a look at this picture. The problem is that the transitions are stiff. The layers are flat, and the focal route isn't prominent. Look at the whole picture. It's all flat, and the wall doesn't have any changes, right? And the transitions are also quite stiff, not highlighting the route. And when we look at the picture on the right, it highlights the visual center. Why is this the visual center? Because the feeling it gives me is that the contrast between light and dark is strongest here. Because it's illuminated by lights, it creates a certain sense of story. Also, our walking route needs to be highlighted, and the less important parts have been attenuated. This way, it will have layers. Then the second point is the layering relationship. The problem with layering relationships is generally the flattening of the scene, lacking a sense of depth. The solution is to divide the basic layers of the scene, foreground, midground, and background according to distance. Due to the influence of atmospheric perspective, actively create a hierarchical black, white, and gray relationship. For your reference, atmospheric perspective increases brightness by 5 and reduces saturation by 8 for every 100 meters. That's why the further away, the higher its brightness in normal daylight conditions. The further away, the higher its brightness. It's because of this atmospheric perspective. Then the verification method is, how do you see if your layering relationship is correct? That you turn it into a black and white image. Turning it into a black and white image still allows you to clearly distinguish spatial layers. The subject lacks contrast, the sense of space is weak, and everything is stuck together. Then we use the contrast of black, white, and gray. That is the contrast of black and white to highlight the subject and the sense of space. That is to strengthen its spatial relationship. Then the lighting, it has a certain attenuation because the light is coming from the outside, from bright to dark, with a certain attenuation. Then we just added a special effect light to increase its drama. Actually, many things are like this. With the development of games, the level of developers, for example, is also improving. It's not to say that the problem with the picture, for example, is not entirely due to technical issues. Do you all agree it's not entirely a technical issue? For example, you can actually do different processing. It's not entirely a technical issue. It's not entirely a hardware issue either, because we are also improving. That is, the developers are also improving, right? The artists are also improving.
Yes, composition. And your spatial relationship distribution, this guidance, these are all improving with the passage of time.
Yes, okay. And this picture is cluttered, so the layers are simple, and there is no route guidance. And this one is visual guidance. That is, we use route guidance as well as level guidance, object guidance, including this wall. This way, it will feel like in the distance, I should go in this direction, and there should be some stories here. In this way, the picture is relatively transparent and breathable. Then we look at this picture. In this picture, the layers are not clear. The layers are not clear. The same perspective occupies too much space, causing visual clutter. We see that its bridge and this stone look like they are in the same perspective. They look like they are in the same perspective, but they can actually be made into different perspectives. So in this layered version, it made a different perspective.
Yes.
In this way, it pulls them apart through the perspective of the air and the spatial relationship. In this way, it will produce a certain sense of transparency, pull apart layers, increase fog, and increase the sense of space. Clarify the time point. The time point is morning, but the time here is not very clear. I don't know what time it is. Then the excessive transition increases the richness of the material. Then this picture has the same problem, that is, the same perspective occupies too much space, causing a feeling of visual blockage. Why does it feel blocked? Because the entire space is occupied by the same perspective for at least more than half.
Right.
So it feels particularly blocked. That is, it's not transparent. That is, I can't see it, so I can't see the distant view. And the one on the right has rich layers and a strong sense of space. Because on the right, it will reduce the main unified perspective. That is, reduce its area and then increase the perspective of the intermediate transition. Okay, this picture, first of all, the feeling it gives us is that on the left, the arrangement of the trees on the left is relatively average. The sense of space is relatively weak. The layers are not separated, and the contrast is relatively average. Why is the contrast relatively average?
Yes.
See, when you look at its foreground, the foreground here, the contrast here is also very strong. These contrasts are also very strong. They're all the same. In my opinion, the contrasts here are the same, right? The contrast is relatively average. When we look at this picture, it's contrast. For example, these places are relatively weak contrasts. You see, although these layers are the detail is very rich, but the contrast here is relatively weak. Then only the contrasts in the middle are relatively strong. And this one is that the elements are relatively simple and lack change. After using the wooden fence here, it will produce a sense of breathability and transparency. Then the focus is more chaotic because we can see that it pays more attention. So the object that is noticed, it may be that the contrast between light and dark is relatively strong. And the two places with relatively strong contrast between light and dark will be noticed. But in fact, for the entire picture, we shouldn't pay attention to these 2 points. So that is, there is actually nothing in these 2 points. What we should pay attention to is your subject. The subject may be these places in the middle. That is the route our character walked, as well as his destination. The destination of the walk. These need to be highlighted, so the contrast of these things in the middle needs to be reduced. Okay, so then we look at this Makoto Shinkai's. The bottom of Makoto Shinkai's is a real photo, and the top is a screenshot of this animation. When we look at the picture below, it will produce a flat, chaotic block. What? That is, the middle layers are blocked by this block, and it can see the sense of space. Then this floor surface, because its layers and the light and dark are relatively average, it produces a relatively flat feeling. So Makoto Shinkai will clean up the middle part. It produces a certain sense of perspective, a sense of space, and then sort out the contrast of the building. the contrast of light and dark. And this place is also more prominent. Next, let's take a look at the contrast of black and white. Black and white contrast is that the chaotic contrast between light and dark leads to visual fatigue. The chaotic contrast between light and dark leads to visual fatigue. This is a common problem. So the solution is to turn to grayscale and then emphasize the main light and dark contrast and weaken the secondary light and dark contrast due to the influence of atmospheric perspective. Different levels of grayscale changes will occur, actively creating a hierarchical black, white, and gray relationship. Atmospheric perspective increases by 100 meters. This is the same as the previous one. So the one below is also the same light and shadow, too flat. The sense of volume, the sense of layering, and the sense of space are relatively weak. And the above is to actively increase its sense of volume and layers. Enhance the sense of layering by emphasizing the black and white relationship contrast. By emphasizing the enhancement of this black and white contrast. This is the same. Let's speed up a little bit. UV break. And you see that it reduces the secondary parts and emphasizes the main part. And here, basically, everyone is average. Okay, color relationship, color system. The color scheme is off, or the saturation is too high. This is a common issue. The solution is to control the proportion of colors, the primary, secondary, and accent colors. Then we look at this Star Sea City. If you look at the picture below, the red color occupies nearly half of the area. And the white color is also very prominent. So this is how Star Sea City handles it. It sets the large area color to green, about 60 UV break. And 30 is probably its oil drum. And 10 might be the flowers. And the words on the oil drums, etc. In this way, you will have visually relaxing area because red itself is a very vibrant color. If we have a large area of red, our eyes will be very tired. Green serves as a buffer. Okay, let's look at this picture. Now, I'd like to interact with everyone about this picture. In this picture, for example, the picture below, where does everyone's attention go? What is the first thing you see? The blue sign, yes. Yes, absolutely. The road sign, the blue sign. The first thing you see is here, the bridge. The first thing you see is definitely the sign. Why the sign? Because its light and dark contrast and its color contrast are very strong. So the road sign is more prominent. But if this is our artwork, we definitely shouldn't highlight the road sign. Why? Because your main subject isn't the road sign, right? And it's not your main subject. Highlighting that doesn't make much sense. Also, the lamp is quite prominent because its light and dark contrast is strong. Then the one above it will sort out its layers, for example, the foreground. The layers of the foreground in the same shot, its contrast is on the same level. The contrast of the same shot is on the same level. So its layers will be clearer. Okay, let's look at this as a picture. In the picture or below, where does everyone's attention go? In the picture below, the railing, the fence.
Yeah.
The fence, yes. So the first thing we see is definitely the railing. And then, so there are these, for example, the red and the blue sign, because this color contrast is the strongest. The color contrast is the strongest. So Star Sea City unifies its elements, unifies these elements. Then it turns all these dark greens into a more transparent green and makes certain connections and like transitions. Then the mid and long range shots, it made a unified treatment. That is the light and shadow and the light and dark contrast. And the degree of detail have been treated to some extent, removing some unnecessary detail. These details, for example, the reflection, if we want to weaken its contrast, we process the reflection to be the same. It will weaken it because the same elements will weaken its contrast. If the elements are more complex, its contrast will be stronger. Its complexity will be stronger. Okay, let's look at this picture. So in the picture below, our attention will also be focused on the sign and the fence because its color contrast is the strongest. Where does everyone's attention go in the picture above? The picture above. In the picture above.
Yes, the people on the road.
Yeah, also the character and the road, right? Because the road has the most richness. It is more rich. The road highlights the character's walking route, and then the surrounding environment. On the contrary, these road signs are not particularly prominent. Although its color is also relatively high in saturation. Relatively speaking, it will weaken a bit.
The puddle on the road.
Yes. Okay. Then we look at the fifth one, which is the lighting architecture. Lighting architecture. The common problem is that the lighting lacks drama and rationality. Then the three-level light source system, the global light accounts for 60. That is, the large area is just global light. Then the local fill light accounts for 30, and the special effects account for 10. You can also use this as a reference. Then the verification method is whether the lighting plays a role in distinguishing the primary and secondary relationships. For example, let's look at this picture. So in this picture, the problem on the left is that the lighting is overexposed and lacks drama. The focus is not prominent. So in the reset version, it will highlight its light source, the direction of the light source, and the effect of shining on the road surface and the ground.
Right.
These are more prominent. Then the other parts, it will give it a decay of the global light. This way, it feels more dramatic. Then this picture, let's take a look. That is, the light is more average and the focus is not obvious. Then the one on the right, its entire lighting is more uniform. Right. The atmosphere is weaker, and this emphasizes the direction and attenuation of the light source, and the atmosphere and immersion are strong. So the whole thing is an attenuation, for example, from the direction of the light source to gradually attenuate. So the strongest is definitely this place, and then this place, and then again this place, because it has a light and dark contrasts and a degree of detail. Of course, this place is also more prominent because it is a larger area. It occupies a larger area, but its contrast is actually weaker. So our vision will have a reading order. We will first notice that it is this place is its main body. Teacher, what is drama UV bring? Drama is that it has a sense of story. Right. Drama. Everyone look at this stage play. Stage plays, its lighting is some artificial lighting. Right. It will highlight a sense of its story. Then let's look at the fifth one. The fifth one is a common problem in the works of new artists. Common problems for new artists. You can compare it with your own works to see if you have encountered a similar problem. The first is that there is no distinction between primary and secondary, and everything wants to be clear, resulting in no focus. This is also what I have been tutoring students. So many students have this problem. A more common problem I have seen is that many students want everything to be detailed, but in the end, it results in no focus and no clear priority. And the lighting doesn't fade, the focus isn't prominent. This is a classic example of using light attenuation to highlight the focus. The focus is definitely on the area with the strongest contrast between light and dark. Everywhere else has a natural fall off. And secondly, there are no transitional elements, so each object is isolated, which is a common problem for students. So if we look here, the connecting areas are very stiff and isolated in this remastered version. They've added a lot of plant elements to enhance the transitions, including ground surface transition. So this plant, everyone look at this plant, its color, expressiveness, and just contrast, all achieve a certain level of unity, right? Achieve a certain unity. After unification, it weakens the contrast, right? Highlight the contrast of the main subject, weaken the presence of the plant. It serves as a connecting transition.
Okay.
The third is the lack of unified lighting. The absence of light attenuation and indirect lighting considerations leads to some areas being completely black and others overexposed. Yes, we can see that. So the light source is not emphasized. Some areas are too dark. So the lighting is too flat. So there's no attenuation. The connections are stiff and there are no transition. So this is actually a natural global illumination. And at the same time, the details, including the transitions, have also been optimized. And this problem is also quite common, which is that the composition does not consider spatial relationship, leading to a crowded, stuffy, and suffocating image. It also lacks guidance. The character's walking route is unclear. This is also a common mistake students make, completely blocking the image, resulting in a crowded, stuffy, and suffocating picture. Then look at what adjustments the remastered version has made. First, it exposes some of the sky. Then it kind of weakens the contrast in areas where the black and white contrast is too strong, emphasizing the natural irradiation of the atmosphere and the transition of the elements in the middle. And also the route guidance on the road surface, the route guidance. Right. Looking at this picture, you don't know where to go because the route is not clear. Without the picture on the right, how should we identify the problems on the left? This is one of the key points we're discussing today. Everything we're talking about revolves around analyzing this picture from the perspective of art fundamentals and basic artistic logic. Even without the picture on the right, you can still analyze the problems. So yeah, that's the result of listening to today's lecture. Again, if you can, analyze it, understand. This is to tell everyone a methodology. So many students, for example, many students find some really good original paintings to do their work. So the original painting is actually a guide similar to the one on the right. If you leave the original painting, you don't know how to handle the picture. That means you haven't mastered the basic art theories, which are the content we talked about today. So next, we need to improve our understanding and training in this area. The light source is stiff and without attenuation. The distant view is blocked. There is no sense of space, and there is a lack of transition and rationality. Okay, so this is an assignment from a student in our class. It's an assignment from a student in our class. So let's take a look. The top one is the finished one, and the bottom one is actually after several weeks of revisions. And he hasn't found his problem. Then everyone can take a look at where the problem is, just based on the theories we just talked about. We can take a look at the differences between these two pictures and what his problem is. Everyone can think about it. Entering and exiting press to shore.
Yes.
Entering and exiting press to shore. The main body is more prominent and the foreground presses the shore.
Yes.
Why does the foreground press the shore? It's based on our theory of layers. Foreground, midground, and background. It's a black, white, and gray relationship. So when in the same scene range, it's light and dark contrast, that is the level of light and dark brightness is on the same level. For example, here, let's look at the foreground. Then each of them is very clear. There is actually no difference between the foreground and the midground. In my opinion, there is no difference. Why? Because its brightness, its level of detail, and its contrast are the same. So it creates a lack of space below, although its things are similar. They are almost finished things, but it did not handle this hierarchical relationship. Understand there is no processing of light and dark contrast, no processing of hierarchical relationship, the layers of near, middle, and far, and the visual center. No highlighting of the visual center and weakening of secondary contrast. So what we do is to weaken these secondary contrasts. So of course, this may actually be weakened further. Then the middle will be very prominent. Then you can see that the contrast in the distance is relatively weak, right? This way, you will have a certain focus.
Okay.
Then let's look at the second picture. The second picture is also an assignment from a student in our class. So yeah, this picture below, we will, based on the theories we just talked about, that is, first of all, its light and shadow are relatively flat. Its level is relatively flat, and its contrast, the contrast is relatively consistent. The whole thing is the same. The whole thing is the same. The one below? Then the sense of space will be relatively weak. It has no near, middle, and far relationships. The one above. In fact, it is not done very well. Because although it is slightly stronger than the one below, but above you see that the contrast here is still relatively strong.
Right.
Because it should actually weaken its contrast in this place. That is the same scene range. The contrast in the same scene range is pretty close. To weaken, including the distance should also be weakened. So, yeah, there is also a problem. So it's cloud mountain overlap. So the overlap leads to this. That is, its shape is not very clear. Then it overlaps, then its element richness comes up. Then, actually, this is not what we want. As soon as the element richness comes up, it will pay attention to this place. Right? For the secondary parts, we need to weaken its contrast and reduce its attention. And for the main parts, we need to strengthen its contrast. Okay, let's look at this picture. The problem with this picture is that the focus is scattered. Yes, there are also common problems. The common problem is that the focus is scattered, and the contrast between the primary and secondary parts is chaotic. This is also a common problem for everyone. As the focus is very scattered. The primary and secondary are not distinguished. And the contrast is very chaotic. Let me take a look at everyone's barrage. If you can't understand black, white, and gray, you can squint.
Yeah.
Everyone who has studied art, certainly when we draw sketches or look at the relationship between black, white, and gray, basically we all squint. Why squint? It will ignore a lot of detail. You can also turn on the blur, and D is turn on the blur, so it will ignore a detail on the surface that is highlight its most essential thing. Then let's look at the focus. Then the first one must be this light. The light and the strongest contrast between light and dark. This is its primary focus. Secondly, it is this furniture. And then the sixth point. Let's take a look at this. A good picture needs to be arranged. Then let's go back to this Makoto Shinkai comparison between Makoto Shinkai and the photo below. Weaken the contrast of secondary parts and repetition.
highlight the lighting and texture of the main part.
What are the secondary parts? That's the wall, right? The wall is a secondary part. Then you look at this Makoto Shinkai's art.
It will reduce the contrast of the wall. We look at this photo, it's black and white, right? The contrast of its wall will be very strong. So this will place it in a shadow, which will reduce its contrast. And the bright parts, in fact, their contrast will also be reduced. It will reduce the brightness of this white wall so that there won't be a very strong contrast between light and dark. Then the overexposed parts of the lights in the middle have also been refined to highlight the lights and textures. Okay, let's look at this picture. This picture is actually very classic. In this picture, let's look at the picture below. Take a look. Where are the places with the most prominent contrast between light and dark? Let's look at the picture below. Where are the places with the strongest contrast? Walls, steps?
Yes, lights.
So are these the focus we want? Not really, right? UV break. We wouldn't emphasize the walls, steps, and lights in the scene. What we emphasize is a spatial relationship. For example, where a character is going and the layering and spatial relationship. And some stories that are about to happen, we want to emphasize these things rather than emphasizing the contrast of the step. In real life photos, these areas are very strong. This is also a problem that many students encounter if we don't have the original artwork. How do you handle the contrast in your work? Then it will weaken the secondary parts. That is, reduce the contrast of the secondary part. Then highlight the rim light. The rim light has a certain guiding effect, so the eyes will look towards it. And then brighten the dark areas to make the picture transparent, such as these green plants, which make the picture transparent. It has a sense of breathability. Similarly, for the distant view, for example, the black and white contrast in the distant view, it will weaken the black and white contrast. Because, as I said just now, the contrast of a unified view, that is on the same horizontal line. The farther away it is, the weaker the contrast. Let's look at this. This is to establish a unified hierarchical relationship. Let's look at this tree in real life photos. The trees are distributed very unevenly. And then it will also be affected by the light shining on the trees, which will produce some kind of changes. Actually, in terms of spatial relationship, it is a distant view. Mid-far view, this place has been unified. That is, the basic processing methods are unified. Then it highlights the bridge surface, right? The expression, light, and texture of the bridge surface, and the expression of the sky highlighting this bridge surface, highlighting the light, is also a kind of breathability. Because the road surface reflected by the sky has a sense of transparency. If you look at the bottom, it feels lifeless, stuffy, and without a sense of transparency. Then we look at this picture. This picture emphasizes the contrast of the front and rear layers. So the most important thing is to highlight the middle ground in the middle, foreground. In fact, a lot of characters are drawn in the foreground, but we don't pay attention to these characters. That is, we don't see these characters at first glance, but see the place with the strongest contrast, right? Including these special effects, the place with the strongest contrast. So in the photo, some of these light and dark contrasts are relatively strong. Right? Then in the actual picture, we will weaken this contrast, including the distant view here. The light and dark contrast of the distant view is also relatively strong, so it will be weakened in practice. Okay, and then this picture, the added filter value in the middle, is for visual rest and blending. When we look at a painting, especially a good painting, your vision must have a place to focus and a place to rest. Is this clear to everyone? That is, when we look at a good work, it must have tension, a focus, and a prominent place. And also a buffer place and a resting place. This is very important. If it's all tense, you feel your eyes are very tired. You don't want to watch it any longer. But if it is relaxation, tension, and delight, then you feel like you want to watch it a little longer. This also emphasizes the primary and secondary relationship, reducing the contrast of the secondary part. For example, this platform here. The contrast of the secondary parts will be reduced. And then brighten the dark areas to make the picture transparent. And then this picture also increases the sense of layering. How to increase the sense of layering? It's also what we talked about just now, right? The same layer, the same view. Its contrast should be unified. For example, the trees in the distant view have been unified. Right? The railings in the foreground have also been unified, including the ground has also been unified. So its level of detail is also the highest in its midground. Then the foreground and distant view will have lower detail. Then in this picture, brighten the dark areas to make the picture transparent. And then strongly emphasize the walking route. It has a certain guiding effect. Then look at this picture. This picture is to highlight the three-dimensionality of the subject. So our subject, what is the subject of this picture? Where is the subject? The subject of the picture above is the building. Apart from the characters, if we only look at the scene, the characters are definitely prominent. Apart from the characters, yes, people building. Why is the building the subject? Because it has the strongest contrast, right? Light and dark contrast. The most abundant details, the strongest contrast, the most elements. So it is the subject. So in the previous picture, its subject is not clear. You see that the details and contrast of the foreground, middle ground, and distant view are similar. In this way, for example, if you make your work like this, then your work doesn't know where your focus is, doesn't know the focus. Because the foreground, middle ground, and distant view are the same to me. The contrast is the same, so there is no change. So this one has changes. Then we will definitely see the main part at first glance. And then secondly, we will see the visual buffer zone, green. It feels very comfortable and the eyes will get rest. Okay, let's look at this picture, which weakens the contrast of its light and shadow, highlights the expression of texture, and arranges the density relationship. For example, some of these density relationships have been processed, and then the filter value has been added, which plays a buffering and connecting role, emphasizing the extension of the road surface. You see, you may not be able to see the road surface here.
So in Makoto Shinkai's film, it will also extend and emphasize this road surface,
including the emphasis here. It feels like it has a certain guiding effect, so the guidance is relatively clear, implying a sense of space and breathability. Okay, let's look at this picture emphasizing the volume of the main subject. Let's look at the picture below. What do you notice? This next picture is quite simple. So the issue is quite straightforward. Yes. The space between the towers, the lights on the roof, and the sign. You'll notice the sign here, these areas. While other areas feel quite average, the presentation is quite uniform.
So Makoto Shinkai also has some layers that were sorted out.
For example, the foreground, it weakens its contrast, highlighting the main subject and the midground. Right. Then the background is also weakened. So for example, the farthest place, it's just a silhouette weakened, highlighting the midground area. So these lights, it feels like they're not really necessary. They will ruin the overall effect, highlighting the unity of the layer. Okay, next let's summarize. A summary of improving art quality. First, when we look at a picture, the visual focus can be identified within 3 seconds. That's the first element. The second is that we turn it into a grayscale image, and then the layers are very distinct. Third, the relationship between the primary and secondary elements has rhythm with tension and relaxation. Fourth is that any screenshot conforms to the rule of third. We didn't cover composition in this lesson. We'll talk about this later if we have the opportunity. Shanfei teachers, of course, also contains composition. And the main material has more than 3 layers of detail. This means that the expressiveness of its main body is the richest in detail and expressiveness. There are 2 midground scenes, environmental narrative, Easter egg. This is also the midground scene. So it has a certain sense of story. It will highlight its sense of story because it is a subject. Another is that the decision-making route and the movement route naturally form guidelines. You can compare these factors and elements to look at your own work. Okay, that's all UV break. Let's take a look at everyone's questions. First, let's take a look at the questions everyone collected last time, the questions collected on the internet. So this is one of the students posted a work. Let's take a look at this work. So according to the content we just talked about, let's take a look at this work. What do you think the problem is? For example, what are its advantages or disadvantages based on the theoretical knowledge we just talked about? You can analyze it, students. Students with ideas can interact. The layers are not separated. The foreground is a bit strong. The foreground is too strong. Feels a bit blocked. Yes. Our terminology, the terminology is used. The lantern says is a bit strong feeling. The main light is too bright, or the 2 sides not gray enough. The contrast is too high. Yeah. When we look at this work, we must first determine, that is, when we do work, we must determine what your subject is. Your subject is very important, right? Looking at this work, now you may first see this Buddha statue because it has the strongest light and dark contrast. Its degree of detail is the richest, and it is also a human figure, right? Highlighting is this Buddha statue in other places will be ignored. So there will be an unclear spatial relationship. as the student said just now. That is, we need to separate the foreground, middle ground, and background in a scene.
Right.
And this is what determines your sense of space. This needs to be pulled apart, and then you distinguish the primary and secondary relationship, right? Because the Buddha statue is inside. You definitely need to put the surrounding buildings, what structure some places, including the influence of this light, just as the influence of the sky. It will have some volume. These things have to be expressed. So the Buddha statue can be highlighted, but now you only highlight the Buddha statue. And other places are weak, right? Other places are weak. You have not highlighted the entire environment. For example, if we are in a very dark environment, what will we highlight this artificial light source? But now it feels like the artificial light source does not emit light. These places do not emit light. For example, here, although it is bright, it does not illuminate the surrounding area. Although it is bright, it does not illuminate the surrounding area. Then the light of the sky is also not clear. So the sense of layers is not clear enough.
Yes. And then some students said it seems a bit blocked. So it is because you may have done a little too full.
That is, the surrounding scene levels are in the same scene level. And the area of the same scene level is too large, causing this too full. So you may need to comprehensively, first of all, make some adjustments in the composition, in the layers, and also in the lighting. Remove the pavilion, leave a Buddha statue. You can also try it. That is, there will be a main thing in the middle. If only the Buddha statue is left, it may not be the texture of this metal. It may be the texture of the stone, right? There will be something like a statue in the middle. Okay, let's look at the next work, the second work. So according to the theory we just talked about, where is the problem with this work? What is the most prominent place in it? That is, where is the place with the strongest contrast? Space. The foreground is a bit bright. The student said that the foreground is a bit bright, the place where the light is. Light source transition, yes. That is, when we look at this picture, the most prominent place, maybe the place with the strongest contrast between light and dark, which is the most prominent. You don't need to make such a strong contrast with this stone. So this stone is not the point you want to highlight. The point you want to highlight may be these vehicles, or some that is, you want to guide something. For example, I saw this scene. Where does my character want to go? So you have no guidance, right? Your whole thing is a dead end. That is a sinkhole, is a dead end. The character is too stuffy to come here. That is, he does not have a sense of breathability. So then the main thing is not clear. Although it is a close-up, it also made layers. The close-up is also darkened, and the contrast is also weakened. So this is very good, right? Then the subject is not clear, and there's no sense of space, no direction to move forward. Okay. Then look at this work. Then this work is an object. So the problem with this object is that the texture of your lantern is problematic. The details and texture of the lantern. Also, the texture of this metal. The texture of the metal is also problematic, including the one below. He does not know whether it is stone or metal. This cannot see the texture. And the bone above, also his relief, he should be different materials or different colors. So this is the same. This degree of completion is not enough.
That is all for today's sharing. Thank you for watching.